So we're going to look at Explain Pain. Again, this is session 2, so we're looking at the biology of pain. So we're going to think about, to start off with, how pain actually works. Take a second to just think about the structures that are involved with our pain system, how that message gets from the area of your body to the point where it actually delivers that awareness that you're in pain. So to start off with in that cycle, what we need are some sensors. We have millions of sensors throughout our body, all reporting on lots of different information. Those sensors, those cells only live for a few days at a time, so 2 to 3 days at most, and then they die and new ones are created. And these sensors act as a sort of first line of protection for our body. They're a bit of a sort of lookout system and are able to collect information about what's going on around us and feed that information up to our brain. So think about the senses that we have. We have vision, we have hearing, we have smell, we have taste, and we have touch. So all of those different ways of our body collecting information about what's going on around us at any one moment in time, and that allows us to make decisions about that and then take action accordingly. So if we think a bit more about touch and go into that in a bit more detail, think about the different things that you're able to feel when you do touch something. Think about the information that you're able to get from that object. So initially we're able to get mechanical information. So that is about how hard potentially we're touching that object, whether it's just brushed past us, whether it's a deep pressure, whether that's causing, whether we've got a bit of a stretch or compression because of that object. So we're able to get lots of different information about vibration as well. Temperature. So obviously, again, we're able to tell how hot or how cold an object is, but also we're able to collect that information within our body as well. So for instance, when our hands get cold in the winter time, we know that our hand is getting cold. Again, it tells us that our hand's getting cold, and we might decide to then either put our hand in our pocket or put some gloves on. And then finally, we are able to collect chemical information. Again, externally, in the case of maybe a bee stinging us or a nettle stinging us, but also internally. So again, our body is able to collect information about different levels of chemicals in our body, whether there's inflammatory chemicals going around, whether there's maybe some lactic acid as a result of having done a lot of exercise. So our body is able to collect that chemical information as well. So in our body, we don't actually have what we might think of as pain sensors. We do, however, have danger sensors, and there's a subtle difference. Danger sensors, the technical term for those would be called nociceptors, are alerted and set off when there's excessive levels of temperature or mechanical or chemical inputs. So we're going to fire off those sensors in response to the fact that there may be high levels of either chemical or temperature or mechanical inputs. That's not always as a result of actual damage, and sometimes those danger sensors can be set off as a bit of a warning signal. For instance, if you start to put your hand near a fire, initially you can feel that it's warm. The closer you get, the more it starts to feel hot, and actually you'll start to get pain before you actually start to burn your hand. So once we've created that little danger message by activating those sensors in an area, that little pocket of information is going to pass its way up our nervous system, so up the little nerve, and that's going to make its way all the way up till it gets to our spinal cord. When it gets to our spinal cord, we have what's called a synapse. And a synapse is essentially a little junction between the smaller nerve and the spinal cord. So think of it a bit like lots of little roads all trying to merge to a motorway. You're going to have a few different little nerves, peripheral nerves, coming up to that spinal cord, and you're going to end up with this junction between them. So you have this gap between the little nerves and the spinal cord, and in that gap, then you've got floating around lots of different chemicals. These chemicals are a way of the little nerves passing their message across that gap. And each of the chemicals is shaped in a different shape. So when the message comes up the nerve from the area that's in danger, it's going to cause a release of some chemicals across that gap. So if we say that little pocket of information saying that there's danger in your left hand, that information is going to be passed across by a release of some squares into that gap. And across that gap, then they're going to start to flow into the square gates at the end of the spinal cord nerve. And if they get enough electrical energy that is created as a result of those squares going into that into those gates, then that message is passed on. So this synapse acts as a filter system, as a way of our brain, our body being able to filter out what is important and what's not. So it acts as a filter system. What's also important is our brain is able to affect the activity at this of this junction. So it has nerves that pass back down that are able to either make it easier or more difficult for those messages to get across this gap. So if our brain receives that danger message and decides that actually it doesn't need to know any more about that, it can send messages back down to make it harder for messages to get back across. Equally, what it can also do is if it decides it needs to know more about what's going on, it can send a message down and make it easier for these squares to get across this gap. So we say that synapse, that junction, acts as a bit of a sorting office. The inputs and outputs are constantly changing, making it easier or harder for those messages to get across. Sometimes what can happen, the longer we're in pain, sometimes those wires can get a bit sort of crossed, and normal messages that are relaying information such as normal touch or temperature can actually start to get passed on as warning messages as well. And sometimes we see that when normal touch or normal temperature can sometimes become a painful response despite it not actually damaging the tissues. So finally then that message goes up the spinal cord and it enters our brain. And our brain receives this warning message. But as we said, all that information is that it's telling us that there is some sort of danger in an area of our body. So it's up to our brain then to try and make a decision about how much of a threat this is. We said pain is there as a threat, as a warning system. So what our brain has to do is make a decision about the level of threat that it feels that we're under. And it does that based on lots of different factors. It can't just do that based on one factor. This isn't a conscious process. This isn't something, when we have pain, it's not something, we don't touch something hot and then have a sort of a 5-minute delay while our brain makes this decision. So it's a very quick system. It's way out of our conscious awareness to begin with while it's making that decision. And we only become aware of it once our brain decides that we are under threat and we need to do something about it. So there isn't one area of our brain that's responsible for this decision. It uses lots of different areas of our brain to try and process this danger message. And the reason for that is it's trying to decide what's just happened and what action it needs to take. So as a recap, the danger sensors are scattered all over our body in different concentrations across our body as well. So some areas will have a high level of danger sensors, other areas will have a lower level of danger sensors. If enough sensors are activated, that generates this warning signal that's sent up towards our spinal cord. When it reaches our spinal cord, it causes a release of chemicals into that gap, and then that signal can be amplified or reduced, and then that message is sent up to our brain. And it's processed by our brain, and if our brain concludes that we're in danger and that we may need to take some action, then we may get pain as a part of that response. It also activates other systems that we'll go on to in a future talk that work together to get us out of trouble. So this table is an interesting table just to have a little look at. And what this demonstrates is that MRI and X-ray findings don't always necessarily give us the full picture. They tell us the fact that actually a lot of changes that occur in our body on scans and X-rays are often a normal part of us gradually getting older. So if we look down the column, and this is a table showing results for an MRI, and this is across a normal healthy population that have no back pain. So the numbers along the top row are age in decades of the people that they scanned. So if we look down the rows of people in their 20s and 30s, we can see that actually these findings are very, very common. And actually, even in your 20s, there are sort of a third of people would show some degree of sort of disc degeneration, going up to about half in their 30s. That height loss in those discs, so them reducing in height slightly, losing some water content, around about a quarter in their 20s, going up to around a third in their 30s. The fact that disc bulges, again, around sort of 30 to 40% in your 20s and 40s. Disc protrusions, so where that disc is pushing out a little bit further, again, around a third. So you can see that even when you're quite young, these changes are fairly normal and fairly common. So actually, when you do get these MRI results back, actually it's to try and take them with a bit of a pinch of salt and be aware that sometimes those results can actually show up some red herrings that may or may not be the reason why you are getting your pain. Because actually, if you look down the column in people in their 70s and 80s, it's almost inevitable that you'll have at least one or more of those changes occurring. However, what we know is that there's not everyone in their 70s and 80s is walking around with back pain. Okay, so really important to be aware that scan results aren't always the be all and end all and don't always give us the full picture of what's going on. And that occurs across the rest of the body as well. So for scans on shoulders, for scans on hips, for scans on knees, again, they often show a high level of people walking around with these degenerative signals on the scans. But the fact that actually there isn't always a good correlation between those symptoms and pain necessarily. So actually it's possible to have these symptoms without pain. And for some people, they can have these very minor changes, but actually suffer a high level of pain. And it's this mismatch that we don't really fully, completely understand at this moment in time. But what it does help to show is that these changes don't always therefore mean it's an inevitable part of getting older that you're always going to have pain. And actually, this doesn't actually follow when we look at the statistics. So as a quick summary, pain is there as an alarm, as a threat system, and it acts on what it thinks is potentially dangerous. If you think about our pain system as a pirate ship, you have the crow's nest at the top, which are our sensors as a lookout system. They warn our brain, our captain, about the fact that there may be some danger, and then the captain of the ship has to make a decision about how much threat or not we are under. What's happening in the tissues is just one part of that pain experience. So if you think about the example of a ship at sea, and the lookout sees a ship, it's up for the captain to decide whether or not that ship is a friendly ship or an enemy ship, and therefore whether they need to prepare to fight, whether the ship's bigger than them and they might need to look at running away if they're at war. And then that's going to obviously affect that captain's sort of decision making potentially as well about whether on how high a threat level they're already under. So in the next session, we'll look at how does our brain make that decision and what factors influence that decision.